Today's case is one that rocked Australia to the core, and its setting in the land down under somehow makes it even more terrifying. The endless deserts, long stretches of highways, and intense heat. A uniquely harsh and unforgiving environment. So strap yourself in because we're about to go on a wild ride. In January 1990, an adventurous young Briton named Paul Onions flew all the way to Australia to finally see the country he had heard so much about. Staying at a modest hostel in the King's Cross area of Sydney, he spent his time sightseeing and hanging out with new friends. He had done a stint in the Navy and found a low-paying job, managing to save up just enough for the trip, and as they say, find himself. After a few weeks, his cash started running out and he began looking for a job. Someone suggested that he could pick fruit in the Riverina area a few hundred miles south of Sydney, so that's where he set off to. He couldn't have taken a train the whole way, but to save money, he got off at Liverpool and decided to hitchhike the final stretch. On January 25th, 1990, he left early in the morning and found himself standing on the side of the Hume Highway in Liverpool, trying to flag down a car. The heat that day was unbearable, but at least he was traveling light, carrying just a backpack with a Sony Walkman, a camera, several t-shirts, and his documents. When not a single southbound car stopped for him, he started walking along the highway until he got to a shopping center. He bought a drink and sat down to rest, thinking about giving up and going back to the hostel. Just when he made up his mind to return, a muscular man approached him and in a charming Australian accent asked, "Do you need a lift?" Paul's spirits rose instantly and he told him where he was going. They got into the stranger's SUV and headed south. The first thing Paul noticed about him, other than his muscular build, was his long, neatly trimmed mustache. The man said his name was Bill, and as they talked, he asked Paul a lot of questions. Where are you from? When are you going back to England? Who knows that you came here? What do you do? Bill also talked a lot about himself and seemed friendly enough. He told Paul that he was a truck driver born into a family from Yugoslavia. He lived near Liverpool and was divorced. They had a while to go, but after about an hour, the atmosphere in the car began to change. First, Bill burst into a racist tirade about immigrants. He swore and then stopped abruptly, refusing to say any more. Soon, Paul noticed that Bill was driving oddly and checking the rearview mirror for several seconds. Paul was tired of their conversation and the road and was starting to get uncomfortable. After a while, Bill leaned forward, twisting the knob on the radio and said, "I'm going to pull over and get some cassettes from underneath the seat," and he stopped at the side of the road. Strangely enough, Paul looked down and saw right between their seats a tray full of cassettes. Why would he pull over? But Bill had already gotten out. Realizing that something was wrong, Paul got out as well before hearing, "Why are you getting out of the car?" Not knowing what to expect from Bill, he got back in. Before he knew it, though, he was face to face with a revolver. "This is a robbery." Bill reached under the seat and pulled out some rope. "Shut up and fasten your seatbelt." Paul was scared half to death, but wasn't about to give up so easily. He opened the door and bolted right into oncoming traffic, waving his arms and trying to get passing cars to stop. From behind him, he could hear, "Stop or I'll shoot." And then came the shot. Fortunately, Paul had been taught in the military that when being shot at, you should zigzag. That's what saved his life. He glanced back for a moment, expecting to see Bill chasing him, but instead he was standing by his car, sneering. Gasping and stumbling, Paul was finally able to stop a van, practically throwing himself under the wheels. And that's when Bill caught up with him, grabbing him by the shirt and pulling him back toward his car. Paul managed to get away and run back to the van, forcing his way inside. Local resident Joanne Berry was behind the wheel. She turned the van around and hit the gas. Her sister and 4 children were in her car. Fearing for their safety, her first instinct was to leave him on the highway, but seeing his face pale with horror, she drove him to the nearest police station. When they got to the Mittagong police station, it was closed. Then they went to another city, Boral, where Paul told his story to PC Janet Nicholson. He described his assailant, the car, and the contents of his backpack, which he had left with Bill. After filing a detailed report, Nicholson reported the incident on the police radio, providing a description of his vehicle. However, she warned Paul that since neither he nor Joanna could remember the license plate, they would have very little chance of finding it. Practically everyone in Australia drives an SUV. After that, Paul returned to Sydney and got his passport replaced. A few weeks later, having decided to stay in Australia for a while, he found a well-paying job, and soon after that, his girlfriend came to visit from England. They traveled for several more weeks in the north of the country before going home. However, after landing in England, it was hard for Paul to get back to normal life. For the next year, he had problems sleeping, and during the day, he seemed to be sick. He never told his relatives about Bill or what had happened, but they noticed that he had changed quite a bit after the trip. In the end, Paul Onions came to terms with what had happened in Australia. Time heals all wounds, but not for long. One evening in June 1992, Paul turned on a rugby game, England versus Australia, but instead of a game, he saw places in Australia he recognized well. The match had been interrupted to report that in some remote place, a place Paul recognized, the bodies of two travelers had been found not far from where Bill had attacked him. A chill ran down his spine. He couldn't help but feel that it was somehow connected with what he had experienced. Hands shaking, Paul called the Australian High Commission and got the hotline number for the team working the case. On November 13, 1993, he told an officer the details of the attack, but the officer surprisingly didn't seem interested. He didn't ask who had taken Paul's statement and when he had given it. Instead, he thanked Paul for the information and ended the conversation. Weeks and months went by and Paul never got a call back, so he figured his story was of no value to the investigation and tried to forget about it all again. What was in those woods that caused Paul's mind to recall that terrible day? On September 19, 1992, two runners noticed a strange smell while orienteering in Belanglo Park. They walked cautiously between the trees, turning up stones, and when they approached a boulder in a far-off ravine, they found what they thought was a dead kangaroo, a leg with shreds of fur. To their horror, it turned out to be not an animal's leg, but a human elbow, and that was no fur. The bodies of Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark had been placed lying in the same direction, heads facing south, making forensic experts suspect that there was some kind of ritual symbolism to it all. Walters and Clark were from the UK and had met in Australia while traveling on working holiday visas. Australia is a very popular tourist destination to this day, and at that time it was one of the friendliest and safest countries in the world for hitchhiking. Thousands of young tourists flocked there every year. So Joanna and Caroline set off for a trip around the country before settling into an apartment in the King's Cross suburb of Sydney. Then they planned to go to a fruit plantation to earn money. They were last seen Easter Saturday, April 18th, heading to King's Cross Station carrying sleeping bags and a tent. 2 weeks later, Joanne's parents, Ray and Jill Walters, started to worry. They hadn't heard from their only daughter, and she usually called them once a week. On May 26th, when Joanna's visa expired, they became even more worried and reported her disappearance to the Welsh police, who informed their colleagues in Australia. Caroline's parents, Ian and Jacqueline, weren't quite as worried when Caroline stopped calling, not even to congratulate her father on his 58th birthday, but over time it became clear that something had happened to her. Both families traveled to Australia to search for their daughters in the hope that they had decided to lay low in some remote area, but fearing the worst. In August, before their bodies were uncovered, the publicity of the missing British girls motivated the police to look into other missing travelers. By the time Joanna and Caroline were found, 5 other missing hikers were known to have disappeared, and all had been hitchhiking along the busy Hume Highway linking Sydney and Melbourne. The first to disappear were 2 19-year-old Australians on their way to an environmental rally in late 1989. Then, in 1991, 3 German tourists went missing. The gruesome find in September would be just the first of a string of terrible secrets revealed in Belanglo State Forest. Since the bodies had been lying in the open air since mid-April, by September the girls could only be identified by dental records and DNA. It was a very difficult time for several families all at once. Ray and Jill Walters made the following statement to the press. "Whoever did this thing," said Ray, "I wouldn't call them sick, because sick people can be cured to an extent. These are evil-minded people, and like dogs with rabies, there is only one way. They have got to be put down and destroyed." In late 1992, a memorial service was held in the forest for Caroline and Joanne. "We have come here today where something wicked happened, so that this place can be peaceful again and its memories put out to rest," the priest said. Time had passed, but no special task force had been put together to investigate the connection between this disappearance and others. Only 3 detectives were looking for the killer, and over the next 12 months, they found practically nothing. On October 5, 1993, a man named Bruce Pryor parked his Jeep deep in the forest and went to collect firewood. He often went to the Belanglo forest and was following the search for the criminal closely. That day, he had a premonition that he would find something, and he did. Under a fallen tree, Bruce found a femur that had been gnawed on by an animal, and next to it, an inverted skull. Just a few kilometers from where the British women were discovered, more remains had been found. 19-year-old Deborah Everest, last seen in December 1989 with her boyfriend James Gibson at a hostel in Sydney. The couple had told friends they were going to hitchhike south on Hume Highway to Albury to attend an environmental festival. Pathologists were unable to determine the exact cause of Deborah's death due to her long exposure to the outdoors, but there was evidence that she had been hit with a sharp object and stabbed. Her black bra and pants had been removed and cut with a knife, and her tights were stuffed in her mouth. James' body was also found there, lying in the fetal position less than 50 meters away. Like all the other remains, he was almost completely covered with sticks and branches. He had knife wounds and had suffered a severe blow to the spine, which could have paralyzed him. Moreover, Gibson's backpack and camera were found on the highway 2 months later, far from the forest, lying on the side of the road as if they had been thrown from a moving car. The autopsy showed that what had happened to them was particularly cruel. As with everyone else, there were no signs of defensive wounds. Now the police were sure they were hunting for a serial killer, and on October 12, 1993, a special task force was finally created under the command of Superintendent Clive Small, including 20 detectives and crime scene and forensic experts. Within 3 days, specially trained dogs were delivered from Queensland. Then, on November 1st, human remains were found 5 kilometers to the east. This time, they belonged to a missing 20-year-old German woman, Simone Schmidl. Her body bore traces of multiple stab wounds. She had been last seen on January 20th, 1991, when against the advice of friends in Sydney, she decided to hitchhike to Melbourne to meet her mother at the airport. She was a confident, experienced traveler who had seen much of the world. Back in Germany, her parents finally learned the fate of their daughter in a terrible way. On the radio. After this discovery, the police increased the number of units to 80 people and expanded their search area to cover more than 20 kilometers. It was becoming clear that it was only a matter of time before another missing young couple, 20-year-old Anja Hubschied and 21-year-old Gaber Negbauer, also from Germany, would be found. They too were last seen in a hostel in the King's Cross area and were planning to hitchhike to Adelaide. Detectives already had copies of their dental records when their bodies were found just 1 kilometer from Simone on November 4th. It was the same story, excessive cruelty, a gag, but this time there were bullet wounds in their skulls, as well as evidence of strangulation. Anya's head was missing. It had been separated from her body by a sword while she was still alive, like a medieval execution, in the opinion of forensic pathologist Dr. Peter Bradhurst. He also conducted autopsies and analysis of the other travelers, and later stated that the criminal most likely was not acting alone. all of Australia and the whole English-speaking world were shocked when the police revealed the details of how the tourist died. Professor John Hilton, who had also performed autopsies and had a wealth of experience under his belt, spoke in a trembling voice as he talked to reporters. Even he was horrified by what had happened. There was evidence that the perpetrator or perpetrators had become more confident each time and lingered more at each successive crime scene. Many of the travelers had the same injury, a stab wound in their upper back, rendering them helpless. In addition, many of the victims were partially naked, and their pants were buttoned but not zipped. Apparently, the victims were tied up, and at some stage were released and moved several hundred meters, the police chief said. In addition, there were quite a few expended shells, about 100 I believe, which suggests that there was enough time for the weapons to be fired. It was clear that whoever was responsible was setting beer cans and bottles on the stump and shooting at them to demonstrate their marksmanship. And then they turned their gun on the victim. However, at this stage, all the police knew for sure was that the perpetrator was probably driving an SUV to get to the remote places and that they knew the forest well. Meanwhile, ballistics specialists discovered that Gaber and Caroline had been shot with the same gun, an American Ruger 10-22 rifle, which was relatively rare in Australia. The investigative team also noted that the disappearance occurred during public holidays. All the tourists had disappeared during the long Australian summer, the Christmas holidays, and around Easter. They also assumed that the perpetrator was a hunter and resided in or around southwestern Sydney. There were many theories, but few hard facts. On November 5, 1993, the government of New South Wales offered a $500,000 reward for information leading to the capture of the criminal, the largest reward ever offered in Australia. Special hotlines were set up, and 5,100 calls were registered within the first 24 hours. The public outcry was enormous. Over 1 million reports were eventually received, of which 10,000 leads were checked by the police. Investigators used a computer system called NetMap to uncover links between all the details of the case, addresses, weapons, vehicles, etc. There were clues, but they had to be put together to get the full picture. Investigators went so far as to request satellite photos. The belongings and remains of the travelers, along with the bullets and shell casings, were taken in for analysis. It turned out that several types of weapons had been used. Investigators contacted members of a local shooting club and examined their weapons. By then, everyone in nearby cities knew what was going on and wanted to help. One of the members of the shooting club told the detectives that his friend had witnessed something very suspicious in the forest the previous year. This man gave an incredibly accurate description of two cars, a Ford sedan and an SUV, driving along a path in the forest. He said that he managed to look inside the car as it passed, and in the backseat were two men and a woman between them with a rag in her mouth, which looked like a gag. There were two other men in the second car, one at the wheel and the other in the back with another woman who was tied up. He gave the police detailed descriptions of everyone he saw that day. He had memorized their clothes, appearance, and even gave their approximate ages. He also claimed to have written down the license plate number of the car on a piece of cardboard, but had lost it. The police took his statement, printed it out, and asked him to read everything carefully, and if everything was correct, sign it. The author signed it, Alex Milat. That last name was already familiar to the investigators. Their list of suspects included Alex's brother, Ivan, who had been incarcerated for robberies, often ending up in the police station for petty theft. He had also been tried for rape. The investigators were skeptical about Alex's testimony. The second witness, who was with him at the time, couldn't confidently confirm his story, and questions were raised about how Alex could remember so many details if the car drove by at that speed. It was all pretty suspicious. Could he be covering for his brother, Ivan? But Ivan wasn't the only suspect. Investigators soon uncovered a report from the wife of a factory worker detailing her suspicions about her husband's acquaintance after the second group of bodies was found. She was talking about a certain Paul Miller, aka Richard Milat, Ivan's younger brother. Allegedly, after the bodies of the British women were discovered, Richard had told his colleagues, "There's more out there. They haven't found them all yet." On other occasions, he allegedly went on, "They haven't found the Germans out there yet, and I know who killed the Germans." Moreover, he had said that a few months before the discovery of the German tourists. Colleagues also quoted Richard as saying stabbing a woman was like cutting a loaf of bread. Hearing all this, the investigators were horrified but not surprised. Criminologists assumed that this was the work of a gang and possibly a family. By that time, they had been studying crime archives, including sex crimes, for more than a day, and decided to focus on Ivan and his brothers. By the end of 1993, the police had begun making inquiries about Ivan from his employer. They found the dates he took days off, which coincided with the days the travelers disappeared, but his brothers had worked those days. The circle narrowed. Several of Ivan's colleagues were interviewed and spoke of his interest in guns. A friend of Ivan's, Tony Serra, told police that Milat owned a motorcycle and four-wheel drive Nissan and kept an arsenal of weapons in his house. Finally, on April 13, 1994, Chief Constable Paul Gordon stumbled upon Paul Onion's story and found that he had called the station 5 months earlier in an attempt to draw attention to his story. He read the statement describing the events of January 1990 and realized that the young man's testimony could give them the answers they had been looking for. Gordon took this new evidence directly to the Superintendent Small, who was quite rightly furious. How could he have missed this key witness? At the end of April, Onions received a call from Australia asking him to come to the station. He was confused, but still boarded the plane, hoping that this was not some cruel joke played by the criminal who had almost killed him and who had all his documents and home address. At the gangway, he was met by a real investigator, and soon they were driving along the Hume Highway where everything had happened. As they neared the stretch where Paul was attacked, he became uneasy. He spoke at length about that day, the tapes, the gun, the rope. When they got to the station, he was shown a photo of the suspects and pointed to number 4. "That's him, number 4. Are you sure? I'd better take a second look." He looked a few more times and finally said, "Yes, I'm sure. The man who attacked me is number 4. Number 4 was Ivan Milat. Now the police had enough evidence to arrest Ivan for the attack on Paul Onions. In addition to the arrest warrant, they also got a search warrant for Milat's home a few miles from Liverpool in a suburb near the Hume Highway. Assuming that Ivan had not acted alone, the police also requested a search warrant for the homes of his mother and his brothers Richard, Walter, and Bill. Their grounds, which they used for target practice, would also be inspected. On May 22, 1994, 50 officers paid a visit to the house in Eaglevale where Ivan lived with his girlfriend. What they found was very interesting. A postcard in which Ivan was addressed as Bill, which was how he had introduced himself to Paul. They asked him why it was sent to Bill. He explained that it was just a mistake. When a bullet was found in one of the bedrooms, the police asked Ivan if he had a firearm, but he said he had none. In the second bedroom, they found 2 sleeping bags in the closet. Later, it turned out that they belonged to Simone Schmidl and Deborah Everest. How did he get them? A bag containing a 12-inch knife was found in one of the other bedrooms, as well as an instruction manual for a .22 rifle. Ivan declined to comment on them. They also looked at Milat's photos. In one of them, he was standing in front of a Harley Davidson wearing a holster with a .45 Colt on his belt, the same kind of gun he used in his attack on Onions. Another framed photo showed Ivan's girlfriend, Challenger Hughes, in a striped top from Benetton, the same top that Carolyn Clark had worn when she disappeared. Serial killers often give their wives and girlfriends the things worn by their victims. The garage also had a lot of evidence: a nylon sleeping bag cover and a tent with a purple headband wrapped around it, just like the one wrapped around Simone Schmidl's head. They also found a makeshift silencer. Milat claimed he had never seen any of it, but that's not all. There was also a hatch in the garage ceiling that led to the roof. They found a plastic bag hidden inside one of the wall cavities containing what looked like spare parts for a pistol, a complete bolt block, trigger, and magazine. It later turned out that they were from a .22 Ruger. Milat was taken to the Campbelltown police station where he was interrogated. He was evasive and uncooperative. When they went back to his house, the police found duct tape, cable ties, and a bag of yellow and blue rope similar to that found at the crime scene. More of Simone Schmidl's camping gear was found in the kitchen pantry. As the search continued, new items were discovered. A camera that belonged to Caroline Clark and a water canteen with the name Simi stretched into it. A fully loaded Browning automatic pistol was found under the washing machine. More evidence was found elsewhere. Rifles, shotguns, knives, crossbows, and a lot of ammo. Almost all of the camping equipment of the missing travelers was found in raids on the homes of Ivan's relatives. The most disturbing find was discovered in a locked closet in the home of Ivan's mother, Margaret. A long, curved cavalry sword, just like was used to decapitate Anya Hepschied. Ivan's relatives acted like they were seeing these objects for the first time, or maybe they really were innocent. It may seem like the police had everything wrapped up and the case was solved, but all the evidence was circumstantial. There was nothing proving that it was Ivan Milat who killed the travelers. Who is Ivan Milat? Born December 27, 1944, into a large family in Guildford, Ivan was the fifth son of Stefan Marko Milat, a 42-year-old Croatian immigrant, and his Australian wife, Margaret Elizabeth, who was half her husband's age. Ivan's father served in the British Army in the First World War when he was still a boy and emigrated to Australia in 1933 from Yugoslavia. After that, he worked hard and long in the port of Sydney. All this was reflected in his character and how he raised his children. He was tough, dished out corporal punishment, and didn't tolerate any messing around. In total, there were 14 children in the family, 10 boys and 4 girls, one of which died in infancy. Despite the fact that she gave birth to so many children, Margaret lived to the age of 81. This fast-growing family first lived in Bosley Park, in the suburbs of Sydney, and then moved to Liverpool, to the west of Sydney. There, the Milat clan settled in a working-class neighborhood in a 3-bedroom house. Neighbors characterized the Milats as hardworking, simple people. They were called modest, pious, and they didn't show off or live large. In fact, they were almost always in need of money. For example, the Milats lived for a time in a shed with an earthen floor and a screen made from an army canvas tent which divided the room into children's and parents' sections. The kids slept on 3-story bunk beds. They were raised Catholic, but Ivan, in particular, had little time to study. When Ivan was 4, his father decided to become a farmer. The family moved to Moorebank, where Stefan organized a tomato plantation and put his sons and daughters to work. Sometimes they watered the rows of tomatoes until 2 in the morning. However, none of this hard work brought the family income. Nevertheless, even in such hard times, the family was outwardly friendly. They knew perfectly well that they could count on the help of their neighbors. Words like clan and gang were often used to describe the Milat children, and neighborhood ruffians kept their distance from this unhinged crew. When the boys got into a fight, their sisters rushed to their aid. They would all take the blame for any pranks, making it impossible to get to the bottom of who actually committed it. But even then, their relationships weren't perfect. For example, George Milat, 9 years younger than Ivan, recalled that Ivan, as the eldest, liked to dominate and would sometimes beat or mistreat his younger siblings. One would probably say he had inherited his cruelty from this father, a strict man who respected discipline and order and tried to instill this into his offspring, and not by the most humane methods. However, it was possible to earn his favor. William Milat recalled how on Sundays, the other family members would sleep in and take it easy, but Ivan would get up early and take care of the lawn to earn his father's praise. This, however, had a short-term effect and didn't change Stefan's all-around cruel temperament. One source recalled how Stephen knocked Ivan down on the road near the house and swung at him with a piece of wood, pressing his butt into the ground. Stephen often said, "If the police come here and tell me that you are in trouble, you better hope that they take you away because I will deal with you as soon as they leave." Margaret loved all her 14 children equally, but she always took Ivan's side. According to the eldest of the brothers, Boris, Ivan was raised in an atmosphere of permissiveness, and it was something he took advantage of. The MILAT'S kept to themselves. They were secretive and kept strangers at a distance, so getting more detailed information from neighbors about Ivan's upbringing was not easy. In an interview after Ivan's trial, Boris said that his brother had showed early psychopathic tendencies and a propensity for violence, although other family members denied it. One thing is clear: as the children grew up, they soon gained a reputation as bandits. Alex Milat recalled that weapons in the house were common as a spare pair of boots. Everyone had a gun. And the guys quickly switched from air guns to hunting rifles. Guns and knives were part of family games and photographs. For this reason, they were often visited by the police. 7 out of the 10 brothers had run-ins with the law, and the Milat family was well known to the authorities. Moreover, if one of them got caught, they would never snitch on any others. In addition to playing with weapons, Ivan played football and cricket. Teachers believed that he had a talent for math and that he had an acquisitive mind and could understand art. Later, their mother said in an interview that her son had a photographic memory and an aptitude for English. Ivan was jokingly called Professor. According to Alex, Ivan was the smartest of the brothers. However, he began to skip classes and was transferred to a boarding school for difficult teens in the hope that it would straighten him out. At 14 or 15, he finally dropped out of school. Around the same age, he broke his arm and collarbone in a motorcycle accident. Since the family needed money, he went to look for work, like his older brothers had done. Without education, all that he could find was hard physical labor. William later told the police that Ivan, having left school after 8th grade, found his first job welding cages for transporting and holding chickens at a company near Liverpool. Ivan worked for some time at a construction site helping dig foundations. He found work practically all over Sydney. In his spare time, he hiked, honed his target shooting skills, rode a motorcycle, and read. He was described as a handsome young man, fit and muscular, fond of hunting and weapons, and very concerned about his appearance. He had inherited a passion for cleanliness and order from his father. He didn't drink or smoke either, feeling that they took away his sense of control, and if there was one thing he loved more than weapons, it was control. All this is a very explosive mix, especially when you consider that with age, Stephen's iron grip had weakened, and his son was more and more often caught committing petty theft and hooliganism, which very soon evolved into robbery and burglary. When Ivan was 17, he ended up in a juvenile detention center for theft. Boris would later tell reporters that his younger brother had said that during an unsuccessful robbery, he wounded a taxi driver in the spine and left him in a wheelchair for life. Milat boasted to his friends that he knew how to turn someone into a head on a stick with a single stab in the spine. His rap sheet grew as he got older. In 1962, Ivan got 6 months in juvenile detention for breaking and entering. In the same year, he and a group of friends were investigated for gang rape, but he was not charged. At the age of 19, he was involved in the robbery of a store. In 1964, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. A month after his release, he was arrested for driving a stolen car and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. In October 1967, at the age of 22, he was sentenced to 3 years and 18 months in prison without the right to parole for complicity in car theft and for violating parole conditions. His mother defended him by saying that he had simply fallen in with the wrong crowd. But that was only the beginning. In the 60s, Milat was living life to the fullest. He seduced his brother William's wife, which caused quite a stir. William wanted to shoot his brother, but he went into hiding for 1.5 months before ending up in prison. After a while, William divorced his wife and reconciled with Ivan, but this didn't put a stop to him. He also had an affair with Boris's wife, Marilyn. He was the largest and strongest of the brothers, and she was incredibly beautiful. When his father found out what Ivan was doing, he told Boris to shoot him, but Boris couldn't do it. He wanted to take revenge on his brother, but pointing a gun at another man went against his rules. Boris is the most peaceful of the brothers. He couldn't talk about what happened to the tourists without tearing up, and was devastated that his name was so disgraced. He had never been in prison and never received anything more than a fine. Eventually, he divorced Marilyn. Ivan's affair with her had been serious, and he was married at the time to Karen, whom he had stolen from his cousin when she was already pregnant. Despite the fact that the child was not his, Ivan accepted and raised him as his own. There were also rumors that his relationship with his sister Shirley went beyond brother-sister. This might be a good time to pause and wash your ears out with soap. In 1969, the MILAT'S moved to Guildford, a more prosperous suburb of Sydney. Milat then became interested in fitness and bodybuilding, even if he still loved fast food, fish and chips, hamburgers, Chico rolls, dim sum. Not long after that, tragedy struck the Milat family. Ivan's younger sister died in a car accident. Wally was behind the wheel. Ivan was one of the first at the scene and held his sister in his arms. He took the loss very hard, and according to the family, it seriously changed him. That's when the more serious crimes began. Investigators theorized that Ivan started attacking travelers as a result of the failures and tragedies in his personal life. A month after his sister's death in 1971, Milat was charged with the rape of 18-year-old Margaret Patterson, who had been hitchhiking to Melbourne from Sydney during the Easter holidays with her friend Greta. According to reports leaked about the case, Ivan, introducing himself as Bill, picked the girls up on April 9th near Liverpool on the Hume Highway. They had no idea about the knife and ropes hidden in the car. The three stopped first at a roadside diner, where Ivan offered the ladies beer. Then he took them to a place near the town of Goulburn, but some sources mentioned Belanglo State Forest, where the remains of tourists would later be found. Ivan attacked Margaret, saying that it would be the end for both of them if at least one of the girls did not undress and fulfill his every whim. They had to obey. Afterwards, Greta said she needed a drink as she felt sick, and Milat took them to a gas station in Goulburn, where Margaret told a waitress what had happened and the girls managed to escape. After that, Milat realized that he couldn't leave witnesses. A mandatory preliminary hearing was held, but Milat waived the right to bail and fled to New Zealand, faking his death. When his mother had a heart attack, he decided to return. He was arrested when he came to her bedside in April 1974. In the end, the accusations were dropped when Margaret changed her story, saying that she had consented to have sex with Milat. Whether she had said it because she was intimidated or whether her words had been twisted in court is unclear, but Ivan was acquitted in December 1974. Milat realized that this was his chance at a normal life as an Australian farmer. He hardly drank, didn't smoke, and lived with his parents. In 1975, he took a job as a truck driver, and in 1978 joined the staff of the Australian Highway Department operating a road roller. His bosses appreciated his diligence, he took a lot of overtime, and his lack of bad habits. Later, he got a job for his younger brother Richard. That's not to say he stopped committing crimes. In 1998, a woman whose name was never disclosed claimed that Milat had raped her at gunpoint in 1978. Milat married Karen in the middle of 1984. He was 39 years old and she was 25 or 26. He was following in the footsteps of his father by taking a younger woman as his wife. Also in the 80s, Ivan's brother David suffered permanent brain damage in a motorcycle accident which seriously shook Ivan. Nevertheless, he continued working on the roads, a job that involved him being away from home for days at a time. In his free time, he worked on his motorcycle, went off-roading in a Nissan Patrol, and hunted. The Milats had a place, a small property 25 miles from Belanglo, off Wombian Caves Road, where he could do all of this and more. The brothers used it for camping and shooting practice. Ivan was a frequent guest. Sometimes he brought his girlfriends and friends, and sometimes he just spent time there with his brothers and their families. It all seemed on the up and up, and the neighbors saw Ivan as hardworking and friendly. He tended the garden and washed his car, and you could always go to him for anything you needed. He even looked after the children playing outside. However, his wife Karen would later say that Ivan wanted total control over her and would erupt for no reason and forbade her from leaving the house. She had to report to him wherever she was going and why. One time he flew into a rage because the house was a mess and he broke a table. He didn't allow Karen to clean it up, so it stayed like that for several weeks. Marriage was not easy for Karen, mainly due to the nature of Ivan and his infidelities. According to her, he beat her and he left all kinds of firearms. During the trial, it was alleged that it was during this time that he had an affair with Maureen, the first wife of his brother Walter. In a recent interview, Maureen said that Ivan was a wonderful person and not cruel at all. She followed this by saying how he laughingly admitted to her that he had stabbed someone and advised her to tell her daughters not to hitchhike, or they might run into someone like him. Karen suspected that he was cheating, and eventually her patience snapped. On Valentine's Day 1987, while Ivan was at work, she packed her things and ran away, taking even the furniture. Milat did not see her for 7 years, until she, under the wing of the Witness Protection Program, testified against him in court. She talked about how dissolute, unrestrained, and aggressive her husband was. He also intimidated her whenever they talked about divorce. He threatened to set fire to her parents' house and car. Soon after the divorce, the house actually burned down. By 1989, Milat had quit his regular job. He began working at sweeping service under the pseudonym Bill to avoid paying taxes and to prevent Karen from claiming his income. He stayed there for 2 months before changing jobs a few more times. At this time, Marilyn, Boris's ex-wife, also broke up with him, but not before having an illegitimate daughter with him. It was 5 months after the divorce, in December 1989, when Milat kidnapped Deborah Everest and James Gibson, both only 19 years old, and drove them to Belanglo State Forest. On September 22, 1992, a few days after the parents of one of the victims made an appeal on television, he sold the car he had used. From 1992 to 1994, he dated Challenger Hughes. They had met through Shirley. The way she characterizes Ivan says a lot. Many people who know psychopaths claim not to notice anything strange about them until the truth was revealed. Ivan loved westerns, racing cars and bicycles, and cricket matches. They often would sit together in front of the TV, and Challenger, an avid reader, would give him books, mainly thrillers by Tom Clancy and Wilbur Smith. He seemed like a solid, old-fashioned guy to her. However, she claimed that she never saw any weapons in Ivan's house. She also said that Milat forbade her from ever hitchhiking anywhere. I wonder why. Finally, one morning, while Challenger and Ivan were still in bed, the police raided their house and arrested him. Milat was formally charged on May 31, 1994. He faced 7 murders, the attack on Paul Onions, and possession of weapons prohibited in Australia. Ivan denied everything, claiming that he was set up and the evidence and personal belongings of the tourists had been planted on him and his family members by the police during the search. The jury, which was made up of more men than women, got to personally see the spots where the tourists were found, touring Belanglo State Forest. Witnesses were then called to the court. The first to give testimony was Karen Milat, then 37 years old. She said that despite her ex-husband's claims that he had never been to Belanglo, they had gone there together twice, to hunt kangaroos and to have a picnic. She told the court that he knew the place well and never used a map. She also confirmed his passion for weapons and the fact that he sometimes introduced himself as Bill. The second key witness was Paul Onions, who again told the shocking story of his escape from under the barrel of a gun, and he stated confidently that it was Ivan who had threatened him. Then, in the 13th week of the trial, Milat decided to take the stand in a cross-examination, an unexpected move. He was so sure he could convince them of his innocence that he wasn't afraid to crack under pressure. He stuck to his story. He knew nothing about the kidnapping of Paul Onions, nor about the disappearances of travelers. So, the Queen's Counsel Mark Tedeschi began, So you asked the jury to accept that someone broke into your locked house despite the burglar alarm, planted a Ruger rifle bolt in the ceiling of your garage, dropped the weapon's receiver in one of your boots in the whole cupboard, making sure both gun parts were painted in the same camouflage colors you use on your firearms, then left a single-fired cartridge linked to the murder of Miss Caroline Clark in a plastic bag on the bed in a spare room. They must have. And then, right near the end of the hearings, Milat, who was already on the edge, was asked, "How can you explain that smeared gloves were found at the crime scene in the forest?" Interrupting him, Milat let out, I never seen the gloves before." After this moment of truth, the defense could do nothing. The only 6 witnesses Milat's defense could muster up were relatives and neighbors, and all they could say was that he was a good person and a good neighbor. In his closing address, Tirashi said that although the evidence was circumstantial, there was so much of it that it painted one big picture. It's almost as if the accused had left a fingerprint in the forest due to the incredible coincidence of all objects associated with it. Milat's lawyer, resorting to a strategic ploy, asserted that the prosecution had no evidence of Ivan's guilt, because evidence had also been found at the homes of his relatives. The simple answer to this was that his brothers had been at work at the time of the crimes, and Ivan could have planted the evidence there himself. Before the deliberation, the judge told the jury, "Circumstantial evidence may be compared to rope, a thick piece of cord made up of a number of strands of fiber. Not one of those strands alone may have very much strength, but when those strands are taken together, the strength of the rope may be very great." And on Saturday, July 27, 1996, after a 4-month trial and 20 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its decision. Ivan Milat was found guilty on all counts. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. Nevertheless, the idea that Milat did not act alone lingered. Even the judge expressed such concerns, and he was supported by the relatives of some of the backpackers. "I think we've got the awful prospect that there is someone out there on the streets who shouldn't be on the streets," Caroline's father Ian said shortly after the sentencing. And Dr. Peter Bretthurst, the medical examiner who performed all 7 autopsies, repeatedly said that he thought there were several people involved. The theory of multiple perpetrators was supported by the fact that 2 rifles were used at the same crime scene and the shooting was carried out from different directions. Some of the branches covering the bodies were too heavy to be lifted by a single person. It would have also been difficult for one person to kidnap 2 people, and cigarette butts and liquor bottles had been found at the crime scenes despite the fact that Milat neither smoked nor drank. Interestingly, shortly after Ivan's conviction, the Sydney Daily Telegraph newspaper published a secretly recorded conversation in which Richard Milat discussed the details of the crimes in a Sydney pub in 1994. The recording was made during an undercover police operation involving Philip Polglaze, a friend of the Milat family. He went undercover for 3 months after Ivan was arrested. In the recording, Richard speaks with extraordinary insight into the consciousness of the serial killer. He also mentioned bodies that have not yet been found. However, this recording was never considered evidence, and Polglaze died unexpectedly in a car accident near his home in November 1994. It was all very strange, but the police never found anything suspicious about it. In any case, Ivan was the one who ended up in prison. He filed several appeals, but they were unsuccessful. He even made a failed escape attempt. There are now about 6 unsolved cases in which he is a suspect, and his brother Boris believes he may have killed up to 20 people. And still, the rest of the family is convinced of his innocence. Caroline, Ivan's sister-in-law, would talk to him on the phone several times a month, and she sometimes recorded their conversations, one of which I found particularly interesting. Check out the link in the description to the video to hear it for yourself. It was just after the deadly terrorist attack on the Russian schoolchildren in Beslan. In the recording, he laughs about it. He couldn't help himself, but even that didn't bother Caroline. She said over and over again, until he told her that he did it, she'd consider him innocent. Before the matriarch of the family had died, she visited Ivan and asked him the same question, "Did you do it?" Allegedly, he confessed to her, telling her the truth. Then, in June 2006, Ivan found himself in the center of a scandal when it turned out that there was a TV and a toaster in his prison cell. He was transferred to another cell where he tried to commit suicide, and not for the first time. Then he was transferred to a safe cell and placed under round-the-clock video surveillance. Finally, on October 27, 2019, Ivan Milat died of cancer. The investigators who worked on the case said it was a kind of universal justice, but his suffering, of course, cannot be compared with what 7 young backpackers had gone through, exploring the world with open hearts and suspecting nothing, getting into the car of a ruthless killer. When hearing about these tragedies, it's easy for some people to fall into the trap of saying it was the victim's choice to get into a stranger's car. They shouldn't have been hitchhiking. Still, hundreds, thousands of people hitchhike, couch surf, and drive around in the most dangerous mode of transportation, cars, without any fear at all. You could be killed at home changing a light bulb, so there is no point in blaming the victims. Instead, we need to focus our efforts on trying to make the world safer, keeping people like Milat off the streets, and saving lives. Let me know what you think in the comments, and as the sign at the entrance of Belanglo State Forest says, please be careful.